All right, video number 2. So we just left off talking about the non-equivalent control group designs, where you have a control group and you have a treatment group. And again, that allows you to rule out some extraneous factors that might influence your findings if you were, for instance, doing an evaluation study, like the example I just gave with the smoking cessation program. Another example of a quasi-experimental design is the time series design that you see here. It's the second one listed. So the time series design, what it does is you have multiple observations before the intervention, and then you have multiple observations after the intervention. So you have 1, 2, 3 pre-tests in this example, and then 3 post-tests in this example. The idea behind having a time series design is that you establish a baseline for your participants ahead of time before the intervention, and then you follow up to see if there are any changes afterwards. So for instance, if we go again with the example of a smoking cessation program, let's say at observation 1, so the first survey we give them, we ask them how many cigarettes are you smoking in a day, and they say, roughly 30. And then at observation 2, we ask them the same question, and they say about 29. And then observation 3, they say 30 again. So you can tell that that data up front is pretty consistent. Then we have the intervention, so our smoking cessation program, and at post-intervention at observation 4, what we see is instead of smoking roughly 30, now their answer was, I smoke 10. So clearly there was a decrease in the amount of cigarettes that they smoked after the smoking cessation program. So it went down to 10 at observation 4. Then at observation 5, we ask them again, let's say a week or a month later, and now they say, oh, I'm smoking 15 cigarettes. And then at observation 6, we ask them again, and it's back up to 30. So what this shows us is the consistency of the findings before intervention, and then after intervention, it shows us obviously, was there a change after the intervention, and was that change maintained or not? Did the numbers in this instance in smoking increase or continue to decrease? A variation to this is the multiple time series design. So there you would have a control group and a treatment group. And so in this treatment group, which is the first group, again, you have multiple pre-tests, then the intervention, and then multiple post-tests. And aside from having that, you would also have a control group that does not get the intervention, but it does get all 3 pre-tests and all 3 post-tests. So that's just a variation. Again, it gives you a little bit more rigor since you're adding a control group. So it allows you to rule out some of those things like, any outside factors that might be playing a role. Okay, so those are our quasi-experimental research designs. So again, oftentimes they have a control group, but as you can see, we did not talk about random assignment in any of these examples. Now we're going to move on to the experimental research designs. So for experimental research designs, if you recall from one of the first slides we looked at today, the 2 main requirements in order for something to be an experimental research design is you need to have a control group, and there needs to be random assignment to the treatment and the control group. So again, what that means is that you have that at a minimum, in order to be an experimental design, you need to have one group that gets the intervention and one group that does not get the intervention. And beyond that, your participants, your study participants, need to be randomly assigned to the control or the treatment group. So the 3 examples of experimental research designs that I've provided here are the most common ones that you would hear of. The absolute most common one you would hear of is this first one, the pre-test, post-test control group design. So it looks very similar to one of the quasi-experimental research designs that we saw, in the sense that you have a pre-test, the intervention, a post-test, and then you have a control group that also has a pre-test, then no intervention, and then a post-test. What makes this one experimental rather than quasi-experimental is this R at the front. The R stands for random assignment. So what that means is that your participants were either randomly assigned to your treatment group or they were randomly assigned to your control group. This right here, this notation that you're seeing right here, is the classic experimental design. So if ever you hear anybody talk about a classic experimental design, this is it right here. And in order for it to be a classic experimental design, you need to have the treatment group, the control group, and you need to have random assignment to each. So this is a very, very rigorous design. It is, again, it's the classic experimental design, so it's a really good one to remember and to be aware of. Then we go to the post-test only control group design. If you recall, when we were talking about pre-experimental designs, we had one that was similar to this but didn't have the R, didn't have the random assignment. So again, if you're working with a group where anonymity is key and you may not have participants who are willing to give identifying information, in that instance, rather than having a pre and a post-test, you could just have intervention and post-test and then have a control group where you just have a post-test. Since this is an experimental design, you would have random assignments to each. This allows you to maintain the anonymity of all of your participants, but you can still get an idea of what the baseline was by collecting data from a different group who did not get the intervention. Then the last experimental research design that I want to talk about is the absolute most rigorous design that's out there. It is the Solomon 4 group design. So the Solomon 4 group design is an experimental research design, and it is the most rigorous out of any of the research designs. With the Solomon 4 group design, rather than having just 2 groups, you actually have 4 groups of participants. So you will randomly assign, because you see the R, among all your participants. Let's say you have 100 participants, you would assign randomly 25 to this group, 25 participants to this group, 25 to this group, and 25 to this group. So you're randomly assigning your participants to one of these 4 groups. The first group will get the pre-test, then an intervention, and then a post-test. The second group will get the pre-test, no intervention, and then a post-test. The third group will get the intervention and a post-test, no pre-test. And then the fourth group will get no pre-test, no intervention. They just get a post-test. Now you may wonder, why the heck do I want to go through the effort and put in the resources necessary to divide my participants into 4 different groups? Why add these 2 extra groups? It seems like overkill. The main reason why anyone would choose to use this particular research design is if they are concerned with something that's called testing effect or sensitization. So sometimes what happens is, simply by taking a pre-test, people are clued in to what the researcher is trying to measure, and that will impact how they respond on the post-test when they take it again. So if there is a risk that a pre-test could sensitize somebody to a topic and that could influence their responses, then you would want to have this type of research design, because it allows you to rule out the influence of taking a pre-test. So let me give you an example. There's an article I read once that used the Solomon 4 group design. It looked at the relationship between pornography and violent tendencies toward women. And what the researchers feared was that if people, hold on just a second. My dog wants to go outside, just a moment. So in this study that looked at violent tendencies toward women and pornography, what the researchers feared was that if the participants knew ahead of time that they were looking at violence toward women and its relationship to pornography, if the participants knew that, then that would impact their answers. And so if they had a pretest, and on that pretest you're already asking about violent tendencies toward women, and then you have them watch a pornographic clip, which was the intervention. So their intervention was watching a pornographic clip. Well, if you already know from the pretest that they're looking at violence toward women, then when you watch that pornographic clip, that's what's going to be in your mind. That's what you're going to be thinking of. So you will be looking at the relationship between pornography and violence toward women, and that will then influence your response on the post-test. So their thought was, if you just have somebody watch a pornographic clip without taking the pretest, you won't be sensitized to this concept of violence toward women. You'll just see the pornographic clip, not think necessarily of violence toward women, just watch the pornographic clip. And then when you get to the post-test, since you weren't sensitized to the topic, you may not perceive that pornographic clip to be as related to violence toward women. So again, in some instances, what they found in this study was that in fact there was a sensitization effect, and they were able to rule that out when they ran their analyses. They were able to isolate that effect so that they could just actually get to the core of their findings, which was the actual relationship between pornography and violence toward women. So this Solomon four-group design allows you to rule out, to statistically rule out testing effect or sensitization, which is very important in some instances depending on your topic. And again, with this one, it was found to be very important with this example I just gave. So again, the Solomon four-group design is the most rigorous design that's out there. It's also very uncommon to find studies that use this design just because it is a very resource intensive. Okay, for the internal and external validity of a study, I'm going to start this on the next clip. So we're gonna cut it off here for now, and I'll pick it up right here on the next video.